certain that there won't be any impacts on services. However, based on what Indigenous Services and Crown Indigenous Relations told us and the information that was provided, it seems that the savings will come mostly from reserves, at least in the first year, reserves that Indigenous Services has set aside. I think it's to attend to unforeseen events. So it is possible that these savings will not lead to significant reductions in services. That and the fact that it will be a reduction in some travel expenditures. So that's what we've been told by the departments. And if that's true, that there won't be any impact on services, it probably means it's savings that would have taken place anyways. For example, money that would not have been spent during the fiscal year and that would have lapsed or returned to the center in terms of funding not necessary for the delivery of the mandate. But as I said, we've received these general terms, so not a lot of information, but if we take that at face value, and there's no reason to not believe that information, it seems that there won't be meaningful impact on Indigenous services.
I'm looking at this article, and Indigenous Services claims that the focus is going to be on things like travel, consulting, grants, and contributions. To me, those are all directly connected to the delivery of services. And I think to members of the public who are, trying to understand these budget matters, they're wondering if there's money just sitting there that's not being used efficiently, why has that been allowed to persist? And if it is being used to deliver services, why is it getting cut? Like, I guess my question is how should a member of the public distinguish between something that is unnecessary and something that is actually a cut to services that communities depend on?
That's indeed a very good question, because if there are savings that are painless, the question that this begs is why were these funds not saved before? One point that you raised that also concerns me, and I've raised that before, is savings in terms of grants and contributions to organizations. And typically in Indigenous Services and Crown Indigenous Relations, if there are savings to be had for grants and contributions, and it's after consultations with stakeholders, I'm not certain that this will be easy to achieve to reduce spending or grants and contributions to Indigenous organizations. Especially, I don't see how these would be achieved if they don't reduce services to Indigenous populations. But again, we have received very little information as to the details of that, and that's something that will be quite interesting to see as it unfolds over the next fiscal year, the one that starts April 1st.
You are quoted in the article as saying details are too vague to say at this point whether service delivery will or won't suffer, which I think reflects what you're saying today. At what point do you feel you will have a line of sight on that question of whether services are impacted by these cuts?
I think it's once we determine or we know which organizations are receiving lower or no grants at all. That's at the point at which we'll know the impact on services.
And will you be looking into that as a normal matter of course in your work, or is that something you would require a request from a committee to undertake?
That's probably something that would require a motion from the committee, as I would not normally look at that granular level of details.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Giroux. Mr. Chair, that's all I have for my first round.
Great. Thanks very much. Now with Mrs. Block for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Giroux, and to your colleagues for joining us today. The recent Auditor General's report on the ArriveCan scam found that it was extremely difficult to follow the money, and that Canadians, in her estimation, did not receive value for the money spent. We have the Procurement Ombudsman's reporting on an extreme lack of documentation throughout the procurement process. and on interesting practices like bait and switch. In your role as the Parliamentary Budget Officer, it is, your role to provide Parliament with the analysis not only on macroeconomic and fiscal policy, but also to help us in raising the quality of parliamentary debate and promoting greater transparency and accountability. And I certainly do appreciate the role that you play. As numerous investigations are undertaken and reports and audits continue to be tabled, what concerns you the most about the spending of this current government?
That's a broad question. I'd say what concerns me the most is the disconnect between the increased level of spending, which is a policy choice, but the disconnect between this and the performance indicators that don't seem to be markedly improving. So departments and organizations have to adhere to performance indicators. So they determine which indicators they'll be following, and they also determine the targets that they aim for. So over time, we've seen an increase in the number of public servants in public expenditures, but year after year, despite the fact that departments choose their performance indicators and the targets, they don't seem to be getting significantly better at reaching them. And I've used the analogy before with some of your colleagues that it's as if you ask the students, the students determine the topic of the test as well as the pass mark, but a portion of them still fail. And that's what worries me with the increased level of spending. So we increase spending, and as taxpayers, we provide more resources. But despite that fact, there are some sectors in the public service that are doing great, but others that seem to be trailing behind, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. I have to believe that you're also concerned with the amount of debt that the government is serving at this time. In your report, you mentioned that there is an increase of $3.2 billion in interest payments on unmatured debt, and I'm really interested in that. For this past fiscal year, this means that total interest payments on unmatured debt will reach $36.8 billion, and that came from your report. In that report, you also specifically referred to total interest payments on unmatured debt. My understanding is that unmatured debt is essentially debt that is not yet due. Is that correct?
Yes, but it's also excluding some other interest-bearing obligations, such as the obligations the government has towards the public pensions, the pensions of public servants. So the interest on the debt is what really matters, and it's expected to be $46.5 billion this year.
Yeah, so you kind of beat me to my next question, which was, are there further interest payments that the government is paying on matured debt, which is not included in the $36.8 billion number that you have cited?
Yes, so as I mentioned, interest on the unmet obligations or the obligations of the government towards pension plans of its employees also adds to interest on unmatured debt. So the debt servicing costs are what really matters, and they're expected to reach $46 billion, and 46.5, I think, this year.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mrs. Block. Mr. Sousa, please go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here again today to discuss some of the mechanics and some of the alterations to the budget as we go forward. And then, yeah, because you appreciate a budget as a living document. So things change, things have to be assessed, things have to be modified accordingly. And of course, your job is to look forward, right? The Auditor General looks at what has happened in the past. You're trying to assess what decisions are being made and how that can then affect us going forward. And it's an important task. It's very important work that you do as a result of that. A lot of discussions about the big items that you've got in your report with national defense, with FTEs, Indigenous community, social programs, and interest on debt are all major items, I believe, that you've highlighted as being issues that have changed or maybe increasing. But then you also have a lot of frozen allotments, right? So you have realignment of some of previous spending focus and refocusing on how we're spending to deliver to Canadians. I think you broke down those two sections. So before I get into the items that are affecting some of the changes as a result of increases, can you reaffirm what the frozen allotments are and what parts of the realignment of government is taking place to offset some of these issues?
So frozen allotments are amounts that have been approved by Parliament, but that the Treasury Board, as a group of ministers, has decided to freeze so that departments cannot access them. And it can do that for a variety of reasons, waiting for certain conditions to be met, or it, for example, or it can also freeze these amounts to ensure that they don't get spent and are reallocated to other initiatives. So that's, in a nutshell, what frozen allotments are usually done for, two broad categories. And we found that they're amounting to, what's the exact amount? Almost $12 billion in 23-24. And $7 billion of that is for to be reprofiled to subsequent years. So amounts that won't be spent in the current fiscal year, but in subsequent fiscal years. And about $500 million of that is repurposing government spending.
And in your opinion, those are appropriate measures to take? I mean, given some of the constraints that are before us, like, are you engaged? Do they give you some forewarning as to what is being repurposed or how it's being proceeded?
I don't get forewarnings. However, we can ask details to the Treasury Board Secretariat as to the amounts that are being frozen or reprofiled. We can, if we want, get into the weeds as to exactly what's being reprofiled. And to the first part of your question, is that a good way to manage? I think it is. It's prudent management to ensure that when central agencies, as we call them, Treasury Board Secretariat, sees that money won't be needed, to freeze it, to ensure it doesn't get spent on other purposes and reprofile to future years. Or when there's a savings target, to freeze these amounts to ensure, again, it doesn't get spent by departments.
Sure. So interest on debt and what happens going forward. Can you give a sense to this committee and to those that are watching, what degree of interest on debt is a percentage of our overall budget today compared to what it was 10 years ago or 20?
So I have a proportion of interest, the overall revenues that interest on debt represent. So it's about 7%, 7 point something percent. The exact number I don't have in front of me. And it will be rising to about 10% over the next few years. That's been increasing. Before the pandemic, it was about 6, slightly above 6. But in my lifetime, certainly, it's reached levels that were much higher than that. It was above 30% in the early 1990s. So interest on the debt as a share of federal revenue, used to be much, much higher. So it's much lower than it used to be at its peak, but it's increased compared to the record lows it reached just before or during the pandemic.
Yeah, and I'm well aware of the fact in previous governments there was substantive amount of interest as a percentage of overall the budget, that it was a substantive amount. And frankly, it was higher interest rates back then too. And there wasn't as much planning in terms of locking those bonds and issues over a longer periods of time. And this government took...
Please. You just wrap up.
Oh, I'll proceed in my next round of questions then.
Thanks very much. Mrs. Vignola, please.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to go back to the carbon tax. Even though Quebec doesn't pay it, it represents 0.15% of inflation, if memory serves me well, in total.